Personal narratives are a type of writing where you will be telling a story about your life. We're going to dive into what personal narratives are and what you need to know to make yours successful. Let's go ahead and begin. First step and first main question is, of course, what is a personal narrative? A personal narrative is a retelling of an event or moment from the life of a writer. In this case, that's going to be you. You're going to be telling a story from your life. If you're taking notes on these, be sure to pause the video at any time to take that note. Let's continue. Personal narratives are best written when they focus on brief moments rather than on long periods of time. I've taught students to write stories about their life, personal narratives, or memoirs for a long time, and one of the things that many students have an issue with is picking what their topic will be. One of the most important things to remember when you're picking a topic is that A, it's from a memorable point in your life, something that's important to you or something that changed you in some way, and that you zoom in on that moment. Instead of telling me about a whole vacation, you're telling me about a specific moment or maybe just an hour or two from that vacation. Most personal narratives are written in the first person point of view. So think I, me, my. I went to the beach. I did this. It's from a first person perspective. You are the narrator. It must start with a strong and interesting opening. We call this the lead or the hook for the narrative. It gets your audience engaged. You want your reader to be pulled into the story. You want them to be so interested that they are hooked into reading this. The trick is, how can you do this? We'll explore some ways you can do this later on. Your personal narrative must be sequenced with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Think about the way that other stories that you read are structured. One of the challenges of writing a story is just keeping it organized. Remember that your audience did not experience this event with you. That means you're going to have to write this kind of like an author would. You're going to have to write it in a way where they're going to understand where you are, what you're doing, what your motivations are, what you're feeling at the time, and all that takes detail. Use transition words during your personal narrative to help connect events in the story. Certain words and phrases connect events in your story and help the story flow. We call these transitions, and this is something else we'll work on. Dialogue is used to show speaking between you and others in the story. Dialogue can be tough to write, but in order for your story to be realistic and true to life, you'll need to show at least some examples of it. And this is something that you can build on as you grow and get stronger in your writing, but it's something that we want to practice when we're writing our personal narrative. Including sensory details is important to describe characters and the setting. Sensory details are things that relate to the five senses and are one way to help bring your story to life. Think, what are the five senses? Think about including details from those senses in your story. How did things feel? What did you see? How did that sound? If you include those details, it helps bring your story to life and makes it more interesting for your reader. Your personal narrative must include a strong conclusion that illustrates what you learned and took away from the experience. So think about the resolution to your story when you wrap it up. First impressions to your story are important, but consider that the conclusion or the resolution is the last part your reader will remember, and you'd like them to have good memories from the end of your personal narrative. One of the big things about your personal narrative is you need to illustrate some way that you changed, grew, or something that you learned in this event. And you should also think, when picking your personal narrative topic, that it should cover a moment that you remember very well. Don't try to write about events that you don't remember or those that you don't remember very well. For example, I've had students try to write stories from when they're, age 2, 3, or 4, and what they end up just doing is telling a story secondhand. They're telling a story that maybe their parents or guardians told them, and they don't actually really remember the details of that. Your personal narrative is more than likely going to need to be something that happened to you fairly recently, so that you remember those little details from this story. Let's look at some potential personal narrative topics and the way we are trying to zoom in. So these are just some general ones. There are way more, but one you could pick would be a birthday celebration. Think about during that birthday celebration, maybe you had a memorable present that stuck with you and you remember how excited you were and how you showed that off to friends. Maybe you went somewhere interesting and had a party or just got to visit somewhere neat. Or maybe you're like me and you've had some birthday celebrations where you unfortunately were ill right on the day you were going to have a celebration. Think about writing your personal narrative about something interesting or somewhere interesting. Maybe you took a trip or a vacation somewhere. Maybe it was your first time seeing somewhere. Maybe you want to write a story about the first time you were on a plane or a boat. Remember, you want to keep this to a moment or event. Your personal narrative could be about school memories, maybe your first day of school and some specific things that happened during that day. Maybe your story could be about meeting a new friend or a time that you got in trouble, which hopefully you don't have too many of those. You could write about a new sibling or a pet. Maybe you got a new dog and you remember what it was like seeing that dog for the first time, writing about the dog's reaction, writing about having to figure out how to take care of your pet in those initial first little, hours that you had it, things like that. Your personal narrative could be about meeting someone new. We mentioned meeting like a friend earlier, but maybe you met somebody famous. Or maybe you had an interesting encounter with a family member that you hadn't seen before, or teachers or other people. But oftentimes meeting someone can make a good story. Maybe your personal narrative could be about trying something new. Maybe you went to a new restaurant and you had an interesting experience there, trying some new type of food. It could also be something thinking away from going somewhere. Maybe you learned how to do something or were successful at something for the first time. That might make an interesting story. You could write your personal narrative about personal accomplishments you've had, such as winning an award. Maybe you had a competition, a basketball game, or an academic competition, or something you were doing where it was very close and you weren't sure if you were going to win or not. And you've got this engaging, interesting game to talk about. Team victories, sports victories, personal victories, or even losses very often make good personal narratives because they're often very zoomed in. You're not talking about a whole football season, you're talking about a specific game. Maybe you've just got a story that would make for a funny moment. Family memories, strange coincidences, weird stuff that's happened to you during some event often would make a funny, interesting, or engaging personal narrative. Maybe you have embarrassing moments to talk about. These are often very memorable for people, unfortunately, and they usually end up being a funny story. Even if it is something that you don't like looking back on, it can sometimes help you look at it in a different light if you write about it. And also just keep in mind that any other moments that stick with you and stick with you to today might fit your personal narrative. Be creative when thinking of ideas. And keep in mind that they need to be zoomed in. You're not writing about a whole week-long vacation. You're writing about a specific event from one day. That's going to make your personal narrative better. Stories that can't find a focus end up being boring. Your readers want to learn about moments that mean something to you and that possibly even affect you today. Think about stories where you changed, grew, or learned something at the end. Let's do one more example about narrowing it in. Let's say, and this is based on a fall break trip I took a while ago, and I've got some topics at the top. If I wrote and titled my essay, my personal narrative, Traveling to New Hampshire, that would be too broad a story, too broad a topic. If I did mine about the day that we visited Boston, that would still be too broad. If I did mine about the day we visited Mount Washington, that one's also probably still too broad. I'm probably not going to be able to focus in my story very well. If I do my story about the day we visited Maine, that one would also be too broad. Instead, you can see with the arrows pointing down, I've kind of narrowed it in a little bit. Maybe the first initial leaving from Kentucky for a couple hours when we were on the plane was very scary with lots of turbulence. That might make an interesting story. Or the evening we went and stopped and looked at a spooky graveyard would make an interesting story. Or being at the very top of a mountain, or having an interesting lunch on the beach. Those would make stories that I could actually do and narrow it in and have a point, or have something where I learned something interesting from that story, or I tried something new. It changed me in some way, even if that way is really, really small. Don't think about your story having to have some big, crazy impact on your life. Even if you changed in just a little way, that can fit for a personal narrative.